Well, we have the legendary Neal Sedlak, a man who needs no introduction, but of course we will out of respect. He is the Gnostic Informant. He is a very interesting, very thought provoking scholar. I've been watching his videos for years. And
Nice.
yeah, very, very interesting perspectives. Hope to get into a lot of stuff today. Uh, yeah, about Neal, your background, how you got into this, and also want to talk a little bit about apocalypse, a little bit about ancient religions. I think it's going to be a really great one. So, yeah, without further ado,
Thanks
Neal,
for having me,
welcome.
man. Thanks for having me, man. It should be a fun discussion. And I appreciate the the compliments, but I do want to make it clear I don't have like a PhD. I don't have like a um training in like the academic sense. It's just more of a thing that I started to do on my own, coming out of Christianity, being very, very into the well, I was a Christian for a while, but then wanting to learn more about the history of Christianity, which then extended to the history of all religions itself, and then talking to a lot of different scholars. So I wouldn't say like, I guess I'd say I'm an amateur scholar. That's what I would say.
A
But
YouTube
hey,
scholar.
I appreciate that introduction there. Thank you for definitely just want to say that's all.
Oh yeah, man. No, for sure. And I think that's what's very interesting about your content is that, it makes a lot of these kind of deep dives a lot more accessible to people like me. Is that,
Right.
because yeah, you get bogged down in the weeds. You're kind of the way I describe your channel and your work, at least like to myself, would be that you're kind of doing the work for us, so that we can, a lot of this kind of deeper layer deep dives into a lot of these concepts is a lot more accessible because,
Yeah.
I mean, you're kind of doing the work that I would like to do. I don't really have the time to do. And
Yeah,
it's,
most people don't, and that's a good point. And but because like when you try to read these academic journals, the language that they're using is a certain language that people with certain degrees can read and understand because they have all that terminology. They've been studying it for years. Whereas I want to take that information and sort of translate it for everybody like who's not, you know, who isn't past their masters or who isn't like, writing a PhD thesis. Like I'm trying to make it so everybody can understand some of this stuff because it's a lot of and I talk to this. I'm not just like this isn't a criticism on academia. This is what they tell me themselves is that sometimes they don't even realize when they start speaking about some of these topics, they don't even realize that they're throwing out a bunch of lingo that people don't understand. It's like
yeah.
they don't even realize it. So when I pick up on some of this stuff, I try to translate it in a way that anybody can understand it
Yeah.
and bring it down to a level that anyone can and just like, how would I want to hear this type of information if I was present if it was being presented to me? If that makes sense.
No, for sure. And I think, you being let's call it an academic outsider, I think actually
Right.
adds a freshness to a lot of what you're doing and what you're talking because you're a lot less dogmatic and I would say siloed than a lot of current academics in these topics. Like you're not afraid to ask questions, make mistakes, a lot of
Exactly.
thought exercises, which I think is really lacking in modern academia. And that's why I think their relevance in the world stage today is, I think, a lot less than what it was historically. And I think it's largely for that reason that,
Yeah.
it's almost like you listen to a lot of these people that there's nothing left to learn, right? There's nothing left to explore. Whereas it always feels like an open question.
Yeah, that's a really good point because one of the things I'm noticing, and it's not just me, and I'm not just like coming at this as like I know more than they do or anything. It's not what I'm saying, but I've talked to other people in these circles of academia and people who do have certain expertise in certain areas, whether it's classicist, whether it's philology, whether it's Egyptology, whether it's Assyriology, and they're all coming at it from their backgrounds, from their
Mm-hmm.
trainings, and they're all looking at these things from different angles. And one of the things that I'm noticing from these different from people in all these different corners of academia is there are certain dogmas
Mm-hmm.
that are like untouchable. And so one of the big ones that I'm noticing now is in in New Testament scholarship, there's a knee-jerk reaction, an allergic reaction, if you want to call it that, to exploring the broader Mediterranean culture
Hmm.
or influencing Christianity. And the reason why is because 100 to 200 years ago, there was this huge push against New Testament historicity. A lot of the great mythicist scholars come out of the 1800s and 1900s,
Right.
and early 20th century, 19th century. You'll find a lot of like Dupuy. You'll find a lot of the dying and rising archetype stuff from James Frazer. Franz Kumant with the Mithraic religious scholarship. And what I'm noticing is some of the stuff that these people put together with the level of understanding that they had, with no internet, these people had to go to a library and they had to translate their own text. They didn't have. I have a whole library right here. I have like 100 English translated classic text from Oxford and Penguin and all these different places that translate text for me. And I have that access to all that today. They didn't have that stuff. So someone like Franz Kumant or James Frazer, they had to go and they had to learn Coptic and Greek and Hebrew, and they had to read it themselves, and they had to come up with their own. So these people were brilliant, and we don't give them much credit because all we look at is this is the things that they say that we've proven wrong today. Therefore, they're outdated. Therefore, we shouldn't even look at what they're saying. I disagree with that. A lot of these people have some really Dupuy wrote this book called the Origins of All Religion. I'm going to tell you right now, that book, don't even bother. It's crap. He's just making stuff up. He doesn't even cite his sources. Now, people lump James Frazer and Franz Kumant in with this Dupuy character, and I think that's very unfair because the work that these guys are doing is really, really, really good. Even if some of their stuff that we look at now and say, he's wrong about this, we did some digging in archaeology and this, that, and the third, we figured out he was wrong about this too. Fine. But that doesn't mean that the 90% of his work is still plausible and legit, and we should be looking at it and building upon it rather than just saying, oh, he's outdated, he's from 100 years ago, we shouldn't read it. So what I'm noticing is some of the stuff that they were putting together in the centuries prior are getting looked at as outdated, and there's sort of like a knee-jerk reaction, an allergic reaction to some of their work, where I'm saying, wait a minute, maybe not all of it's correct, but there's something going on here. And like, for example, like we're coming up on Easter, and the Gospels say that Jesus went down to Passover, and that's when he got crucified. And this is just sort of accepted as, well, the text says so, it's plausible, we don't have any reason to deny it. But then you look around at some of these other Mediterranean cultures, the Hilaria festival, the Serapia festival, the Dionysia festival, which is in the spring equinox. Mm-hmm. You have, and if you look at, and then you have the Akitu festival in Babylon, and some of their stuff that they're celebrating are ritual mourning. For example, the ritual mourning for Attis during the Hilaria festival is taking place in the last week of March, leading into April. So it's a spring equinox festival, mm-hmm. and it's a death and resurrection festival for a god during the week that Jesus went down to Passover. And all I'm saying is, wait a minute. Do you think so? It's either a coincidence, which would be crazy to me, that there's a coincidence that some guy went down to Jerusalem during the Passover weekend, which is the spring equinox, dies, and then resurrects 3 days later, almost exactly as the character of Attis in mythology does, where he castrates himself, dies, and then according to the festival tradition, there's a day of, they call it the Day of Blood, and then after 3 days after this, and I have a whole video on this. I've showed the whole calendar. It's in a lot of different sources, especially Roman sources, where they show that followed by 4 days, the Day of Rejoicing, which the word Hilaria means in Latin, rejoicing. So you have a resurrection festival, and it was happening not only in Rome, in the city of Rome, but also in Alexandria, Egypt, in Syria, in Asia Minor, in Greece. This was a big festival happening. And all I'm saying is, wait a minute, we're just going to ignore that this was going on, and it's the same week as Jesus's death
Yeah.
and resurrection. And I'm just,
Yeah.
all I'm saying. Look, I'm not jumping to any conclusion. I'm not saying that this didn't happen, but I'm saying I think we need to open up some of these options a little bit. Say maybe Jesus didn't go down on Passover. Maybe he went down on a different day, and that story gets changed to fit this cultural motif of the spring equinox, death and resurrection. Because the spring equinox itself, if you look back at even the older Bronze Age festivals, talking about Babylonian Akitu festival, there's a ritual mourning for the god Tammuz, whatever you want to call him.
Yep.
And this is, we know that people in Israel knew about this because it's in Ezekiel's text. Ezekiel talks about the ritual mourning for Tammuz in his writings. And not only that, in the story, Tammuz gets brought down into Hades and the underworld. I'm not sure what the word is in Akkadian, but the goddess Inanna comes down and brings him back up. There's different versions of the story, but there you have a spring equinox festival that has another dying and rising central motif there. And all I'm saying is, I'm not saying Jesus. People immediately assume that I'm going to straight mythicism on this. I'm not saying that. I'm saying this guy probably did exist, but I'm saying a lot of the stuff written about him seems to be applied from these legends that
Yeah.
are very, very famous legends that everybody is following.
Oh man, I love it. And I want to dive so much deeper into what you said. And one thing that really stands out in your work is this concept that the thing I struggle with a lot of Christians is this idea of their religion being static, right? Like came down, kind of the quintessential would be the Jews, right? It came down from Moses on the mount, straight to tablet, the zero evolution. When you really lay the case that is not how religions came to be. It is very much an evolution, right? And yeah, just before that, I'd just be really curious, like, because my understanding is you were a Christian yourself, correct? So I'd
Yes.
just be curious to learn a little bit more about your background, yeah, your religion, and how you came to kind of start getting into what you're doing today.
Yeah. So I talked about this on my channel and some other places as well. For anyone who doesn't know, uh, I had a little bit of a rocky part in my life where I was kind of getting in trouble a lot and ended up in prison. And when I was there for 18 months. And when I was there, I read the Bible cover to cover and ended up becoming a Christian as a result. Got baptized, joined a church after I left, and did that life for a while. And I actually grew up Catholic, but I didn't go back to being a Catholic. I went to trying out this Baptist evangelical, the typical American evangelical / Baptist church
Yeah.
that you kind of the crowd that was there on January 6th, that crowd. I was one of those people.
Okay.
Not to get political, but just showing you where I was at. And so then I was there I joined that church for years, a while. And then I went to a different church after that. It was a Pentecostal church. And I tried the whole spiritual speaking in tongues. And then I started reading into, because when I started reading Paul, I'm like, why does he keep talking about tongues? What is he talking about? What is he talking about prophecy? And then I started really, when you start learning about the Greek, he's talking about gnosis as well. They translate it as knowledge. But the context that Paul uses it is Paul. And then I start learning about these other groups of Christianity that existed before Constantine.
Mm-hmm.
I use Constantine as like the figure of when Christianity becomes the state religion. It didn't become the only state religion under Constantine. Obviously, that happens later in Theodosius' time. But Constantine definitely takes Christianity from being the secondary religion and makes it the primary religion. That's no doubt. Constantine is the guy for that. He's the one who calls in the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. So there's I use Constantine as the as the before and after for Christian being the
Yeah.
church. So what happened before that? What happened in between Jesus and Constantine? Well, a lot of stuff happened before that. And if you see my video that's posted on my channel called "They Lied About the First 100 Years of Christianity," I think I deeply explore that topic very well,
Yep.
where this idea of heresy and orthodoxy is very misinterpreted, I think you should say. Yeah, because we interpret it through the lens of the church fathers later on.
Mm-hmm.
So after, we're talking 4th and 5th century historians looking back and saying, though those were heretics and those were orthodoxy. And all they're doing is they're looking back at Justin Martyr and Irenaeus and Hippolytus and who else? Some of these, Clement of Alexandria.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole bunch. And so they're looking at them and saying they were orthodoxy because we line up with them more. And those other people like Marcion and Basilides and Marcus Magus and Valentinus, those guys are all heretics because we don't line up with them as much. And they said things that we disagree with. But really, if you put yourself in the time period of the 2nd century, late 1st century, even going all the way up until the beginning of the 3rd century, what you find is they have a lot more overlap with each other, especially from Paul.
Mm-hmm.
I used to have this weird misconception about Paul, about orthodoxy being Pauline Christianity, and the Gnostics were anti-Pauline. I don't even know where I got that from. I think that's just like implied for people who don't understand the real history. But then when you start learning about these Gnostics, they were all followers of Paul. You come to find out, Marcion was the first Christian to have a canon, a collection of texts that he said were the true text. Mm-hmm. He's the first person that shows up in Christian history with a New Testament. And in his New Testament were 7 letters of Paul and the Gospel of Luke. Mm-hmm. So that tells you something right there. Then you come to find out that the letters of Paul are not all authentic. Some of them are written later. They're written differently. You can tell by the way the Greek is put together. It's not the same person. He's not addressing things the same way. He has different opinions, that he's contradicting himself. What's going on here? It turns out that these 7 authentic letters of Paul line up with some of these Gnostic heretics, mm-hmm. when he talks about speaking in tongues and doing prophecy and having gnosis, all that stuff that he says about that are, and he's very Platonic in his thinking. And a lot of these early Gnostics were like, instead of praising Isaiah and Hosea in Jesus, we should do Pythagoras and Plato in Jesus. So they're looking at the Greek philosophers as prophets in the same way as a 1st century Jew would look at the prophets of his past. Yep. in Judea. And so what I'm noticing is Christianity seems to have come out of a fusion of what I would say Middle Platonism, which is Stoicism and Platonism in the 1st century. And it comes out of a fusion with Middle Platonist philosophy with Greek Septuagint Judaism. Mm-hmm. When I mean by Greek Septuagint Judaism is that when you find out about the culture of Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt in the first and 2nd century, you find out there was a lot of Jews living in those cities. Pergamum, which is the 2nd biggest library in the Roman Empire next to Alexandria, which is another city that they all were living in. Philo of Alexandria is a great example. Aristobulus is a great example. And then you read their stuff, and you're reading, they're speaking in Greek, they're writing in Greek, they're knowledgeable of the Greek philosophers, but they also love their Moses. And they're also quoting the Septuagint. And in these big cities, these are very educated, very philosophical Jews with writing in Greek, speaking in Greek, and they're sort of hesitant to follow the Mosaic law to a T. They're like, whatever. The Sabbath, who cares? Circumcision, we should follow it, but we don't have to follow it. Yeah. So they're not like completely shutting it down, but they're not following it to a T either. They're kind of doing this thing. Moses said it. Who cares? And it sort of lines up with the attitude of Christianity that happens. And so what I'm looking at is I'm saying, who are these people? Where were they? What were they doing? What was their ideas? And I'm looking at it from that lens rather than just saying, oh, Christianity was this miracle that just sprouted up out of nowhere in the middle of, and this guy named Jesus just teaches all these ideas, and they're persecuted for 200, 300 years, and then they magically take over the Roman Empire. And like that, no, that's not. There's a lot of steps in between, and that's the type of stuff I like to talk about on my channel.
Yeah, no, I get it. And so was it learning about the Council of Nicaea, the early Gnostic gospel, Gospel of Thomas, all of that, which started to kind of, was that what kind of brought you out of the, let's say, traditional Christian view? It was just,
like I said, the last church I was at was that Pentecostal church, and I wanted to explore the more spiritual side of Christianity and what it was. What do they mean by tongues? What do they mean by the Spirit? What do they mean by getting baptized through the Spirit rather than through water? What does that all mean? And that's what led me down. So the Pentecostal church, I think, is the church that holds a lot of the same ideas that the Gnostics held on to.
Yep.
And it just happened to be that was my last church that I was at. So I don't know if that sort of pushed me in that direction or not, because I noticed the evangelical Baptist church that I was at, they didn't have anything like that. They actually made fun of that stuff. And I used to think to myself, well, they're making fun of all this stuff, but Paul's talking about it. So who gives them the right to make fun of people speaking in tongues when Paul's the one who's talking about this stuff?
Yeah.
So that sort of pushed me away from the whole conservative type of Christianity into the more spiritual side of Christianity, which then I wanted to go farther than that.
Yeah.
And what's farther than that? You get into the. By the way, when I say Gnostic, I want people to realize I'm just using that term because it's very familiar.
Yep.
But they didn't call themselves Gnostics; they just call themselves Christians, and I think that's important for people to realize. They didn't consider themselves different than Justin Martyr or Irenaeus. They thought of themselves as followers of Jesus. They believe in the resurrection. They did have differing opinions on the nature of God the Father. Don't get me wrong; they have a lot of differing opinions. But if you look at some of the early 2nd century sources, they all had differing opinions. Yep. They weren't putting together councils at Nicaea. The only council that supposedly happened is the one that Paul talks about when he says he met with James and Cephas for 14 days in Jerusalem. And the people debate on it. Was it really a council? What was it? Who knows? We have no idea. There's no evidence of like what happened. We don't have any archaeology to go with. We just have what Paul says. So I have no problem calling that the first council. I don't even care. I'll grant that all day. Fine, it's a council. But what we don't have after that council is an idea for Christians to follow that say Gnostics are wrong, and I'm using that term again, and the orthodoxy is right. Neither of those terms existed yet.
Yep.
There's no Gnostic, there's no Orthodox. There's just Christians with different ideas. And those ideas get fleshed out over the course of 200, 300 years. It takes a long time for those ideas to get fleshed out. So what I'm saying is these people who are called heretics are big fans of Paul. And that's a big deal. Why are they such big fans of Paul if they're so wrong? Right? Wouldn't you think it'd be the other way around? Didn't you think if they were such heretics, they would be against Paul, right? But it's not the case. You find out Marcion's father was Philologus. Philologus is one of the 70 disciples that actually met Jesus. And like you might be watching this saying, how do we know that's true? Well, I don't know if it's true or not. But what I do know is no one can test this. Even the people who hate Marcion are like, yeah, his father was Philologus. So there's no reason to actually deny it either. So whether it's made up or not is beside the point. The point is people thought Marcion, this big heretic Marcion, people thought his father was one of the 70 disciples of Jesus. And he's the main heretic of all. He's the worst. He's the one that everyone goes after the most when it comes to heresy. So that should tell you something about who these heretics are. They're
Yeah.
not as far off from Jesus as we think they are. In fact, and I would argue some of them are closer.
Yeah, man. Oh, so much baked into what you said there. Yeah, it's just it's so fascinating, right? And you know, going through my own, like I still have a very soft spot for Christianity and Christians. And where I live on like a ranch in the middle of nowhere, and everybody here, all my friends are like devout Christians, awesome families, you know. But yeah, I don't think a lot of people realize, like, even within Christianity today, you know, each individual's definition of what a Christian is very different. You know, even though they act like they're one, body of Christ, there is a lot of beef. But going back
Yes.
to the ancient days, right? I've heard you said that a Baptist and a Mormon today have more in common than the early
Yes.
Christians, and I found that fascinating. So maybe we could dive into that
That's
a little bit.
that's the best thing to say to somebody to introduce this subject. And the reason why, because everyone knows how different Christian or a Catholic is to a Mormon. They don't even have the same Bible books. The Catholic Bible has extra books like Tobit and stuff like that, whereas the Mormons have a different tradition of the Old Testament, but they also added books to the New Testament. You have all these different Joseph Smith texts and all this stuff. So everyone's familiar with the big differences between, there's almost like two opposites on a spectrum
Yeah.
of Christianity, Mormonism and Catholicism, or even if you want to say Greek Orthodoxy,
Yeah.
being in the farthest spectrum of on that side, and Mormonism being the farthest on this side. But what I tell people is, once you realize that the Mormons have more in common than the early Christians did with each other,
Yep.
that's what makes you say, what? How is that even possible? And then you find out, like, if you read Clement of Rome, one of the first popes, supposedly, he's one of the bishops that follow Peter in the line of succession of bishops of Rome.
Yep.
So he's on the Catholic list of all time popes. And we have some of his writings, and he talks about there being a bird called the phoenix that rises out of Arabia every 1,000 years, flies into Egypt, and then dies and resurrects, and it's a symbol of Christ. He doesn't talk about this as a myth. He talks about this as a real thing in history. You can read it for yourself.
Yep.
And
Okay.
that's just so. I give that as an example. It's like, here's somebody who's considered not only a saint but one of the popes, talking about this idea of a thing that you would, anybody, if I said it today, if I was a Christian from the pulpit talking about the phoenix, people would say, what am I talking about? It's heresy. That's not in the Bible anywhere, because it's not. But it gives you an example of, like, early Christians had a bunch of differing opinions on certain things and ideas. And they were all over the place. The things Paul is saying, Paul is arguing with people like James, who says it's about works. And
Yeah.
Paul is saying, no, it's about just faith alone can get you saved. And there's all these different things happening within the early Christian world. The Valentinians, they're big on their on initiation and taking Eucharist, and how that needs to be a spiritual experience. You need to have God enter your spirit and clean your spirit, and then from within, sort of like a Bacchic Eleusinian thing. And all these people, and by the way, Valentinus was almost a bishop of Rome too. He was the second. He had the second most votes. He wouldn't be on your list of popes right now if he got a couple more votes. So what I'm saying is, these early Christians, who are all, they didn't hate each other. They all were all within the banner of the Great Assembly, the Great Ecclesia, which what translates to the church today. They're all within that banner of the great church, but they all have different ideas, and they're way, way, way farther apart back then than we see today with Mormons and Catholics.
Yeah, and it's so funny. Just on the topic of heresy, right? Like, in almost every, let alone denomination, just in every church, there's a different view of heresy. But a lot of what's so interesting in your work is, it's almost like they cover it up after the fact, right? Like what even their predecessor said was heresy. No, now there's been a revision, and then they kind of almost whitewash the history, like, oh no, it was always like this. And I think that's
Right.
what's so interesting, right? Is there has been this like fluid, almost evolution and restructuring, but they almost seem to kind of like obfuscate that almost intentionally. I'm curious, why do you think, like, because you see this phenomenon a lot, not just in Christianity, but in Judaism and likely, I would say, Hindu as well, although it probably was cleaned up a long time ago, right? But yeah, I'd just be curious, why do you think that phenomenon exists? Like, is it just the need for congruency or perceived
Yeah.
congruency, or what do you think is going on there?
I think once you have Chris, this is actually a good question. I thought about this a lot too. And I think the best way to understand it is that Christianity early on is not being led by a state government that has to have one head. And Christianity early on has different sects and denominations in different cities, different languages. There's Syriac Christians in Antioch, Syria.
Yep.
There's Coptic Christians in Egypt. There's Greek Christians all over. There's Latin Christians in Rome. And they're all talking in different languages, and they're all following the gospels to the best of their ability, but they also have their cultural influences. So even going beyond Rome, when you start looking at like the Manichaeans who can, follow Jesus, and the Mandaeans that follow John the Baptist, and they're all coming out of the same cultural milieu and same traditions, but they're all being influenced by their own local traditions. So with the Mandaeans, you see a lot of, Arabic influencing, and with the Manichaeans, you see a lot of Persian influences, and there's all these different influencing happening within these local Christian groups. And even John Kloppenborg points this out in his book on Christ associations. The Greek cities like Corinth and Ephesus and Athens, they're running their churches the same way you would see a cult of Apollo run their cult.
Yeah.
The same way you see the cult of Dionysus in Athens, which is the Eleusinian Mysteries. They're all running in a similar fashion, and which shouldn't surprise you, because you do what you're familiar with. You don't just, like, if you're running like they're gonna run their church. Yeah, they're Christian. Yeah, they're not pagans. They're not. They think of themselves as the real true way of how to do religion, but they're familiar with how these other cults operate, so they do it the same way. They do it a similar fashion, and the same way with the Romans do. You even see this with the bishops and the I guess you can call it a wand or a staff, but the Roman bishops hold the curved staff that looks like a shepherd's
Yep.
crook, right? They still today have that. You can see the Pope holds it. And then in the East, the Greek patriarchs, they hold a whole different staff that has two serpents coiled around it,
Yep.
and it looks like the wand of Mercury. And then you come to find out that that's how Greek priests held their staffs before Christianity was. So they're what does that mean? What does that tell you? I mean, they're secret pagans? No, I'm not saying that. What it means is they're following cultural motifs that predates them, but they're just Christianizing them.
Yep.
So what happens is, as a result of that, and all these different cities that Christianity is growing in, you get different cultural examples of Christianity, and eventually, when we get to the 4th century, when you have a state religion like a Roman imperial cult, for example, they have to have unity. They have to have one way of doing things. Otherwise, then you won't have contradictions in the church. You won't have, certain things need to be settled.
Yep.
And the idea of like needing things to be settled wasn't really a problem yet. Even if there are writings like Irenaeus and Hippolytus who are calling out so-called heretics, yeah, you do see that. But what I'm saying is, you really don't see the more things they have in common that are less apparently differing opinions on, like the nature of God. Is it they're both? Is it God the Father and God the Son? Are they both God? Is one of them divine and the other one's not divine, or did he make him divine? All that stuff sort of comes into question after Rome, as an imperial system, decides that this is the religion that we're going to promote. We need to settle all these differences now. And that's why you start seeing, after the 4th century, you start seeing this need to hold these councils and to settle all these differences.
Yeah.
Rather than before that, you just had different sects of Christianity, and they were all allowed to coexist and just sort of, we agree on Jesus, but we differ on these things.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Like when you kind of when you peel behind, right? Because as somebody, like when you are a Christian, right, and you operate under faith, you know, you're never really asking these types of questions, right? You're just kind of you're presuming, you know, not only the faith but the denomination and even the church you're at, you know, is kind of like the truth, right? You're suspending that kind of, you know, rational or logical part, you know, and I do think there's an importance and beauty in faith personally, but as a result of that, the issue can be, right, you're not exposed to this type of information, which I think is really critical for Christians today to at least understand the history, you know, from different perspectives, because otherwise I think you can get into a lot of problems, right? Like,
I agree. Yeah, and it's funny because that sort of mentality, of like what's canon and what's true and what's not true, becomes like it becomes the central thing of what like Christianity is.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you get people getting killed over heresy just for believing something different about events that happened a thousand plus years ago, and like you believed something different about that event so that you deserve to die over it. Like I'm talking about, like, 16th century, when you start getting all these different Lutherans and all these different Protestant sects coming out the woodwork, and there's like wars being fought over this stuff, and it's become such a big deal. And if you can see how this all starts from these ecumenical councils, from this need to have one way is true and all the other ways are not. Where the reason why I'm saying that, because before Christianity, what you have in the Roman imperial cult, and when there's all these different cities with their different traditions, like you go to Cyprus and there's the Temple of Aphrodite. You go to Egypt and you have the Temple of Serapis. You go to Athens and you have the great Athena statue and Zeus. And Rome has their temple. Rome has the different temple complexes in Rome. The Temple of Saturn, for example, where the big bank is, basically. And they're all allowed to coexist and have different traditions, as long as they, pay the tribute to Caesar. And there's like certain things matter, certain things don't. But Christianity sort of takes this whole nother approach where heresy is taken seriously. Differing opinions matter.
Yeah.
And it almost, in a weird way, they almost set up, and people are gonna hate me for saying this, but I have to give credit where credit's due. They're almost setting up the mindset for a scientific method.
Mm-hmm.
You understand what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
Because
Yep.
before Christianity, people had different philosophical ideas. Look at the pre-Socratics, for example. The pre-Socratics have hundreds of different ways of. Some people think we all came from fire. Some people think we all came from water. That's complete opposites. Some people think there's many gods. Some people think there's one God. There's so many different philosophical opinions prior to the imperial Roman Byzantine world. But after that, after you have all this one truth, and it's this, you sort of set up the mindset of, well, what else is true and what else is not true?
Yeah.
And so I would give some credit to that sort of mindset of what the scientific method mindset is. If that made sense.
Yeah, no, for sure. It definitely does. And it's something like what I really like about your work is that same with a lot of my stuff, I seem to be pissing off both the Gnostics and the Christians, even though I love them both, and I feel like, if you're doing your job correctly, you're going to kind of piss off everybody, like I got
Exactly.
friends that are like Catholics, right? And I was Seventh-day Adventist. So back then, I thought the Bible was biblical to worship on. I thought Sunday was pagan because it's the day of the sun,
Mm.
and I would talk to, and I never really got on Christian or Catholicism. I just wasn't exposed to it. And, I'd talk to my friends, even recently. I'm like, hey, like Christmas, they're like, Christmas is for Christ. A lot of the Christian or, conservatives talk about the war on Christmas, which, okay, whatever. But, I'm like, winter solstice, Jesus, right? Like,
Yeah.
this lines up, right? And in Seventh-day Adventism, it was seen as idolatry, sun worship, and, paganism. Whereas Catholics today, God bless them, no beef with Catholics, all of you who might be watching are Catholic, but to me, it's obvious that there is this sun worship component, and I don't see any strong evidence biblically that Jesus was born on December 25th. I think it
Yeah, there's
is,
none.
yeah, right. So,
None. It
so
doesn't say anything about there being a winter solstice or him being born. Like, there's no dates. There's no like in the 7th month of the reign of Tiberius. There's nothing about when he was born. And yeah, I didn't mean to cut you off, but like
no,
it
it's good.
needs to be said. It needs to be said. Why is it that 4 centuries later they have a birth date lining up with the winter solstice? Like that
Yeah,
makes it should be something people should be asking.
yeah, yeah,
And it's funny because even in modern scholarship, even critical scholars will say, well, you know, they'll say, well, Sol Invictus, the feast for Sol Invictus comes way later. We don't really know if Christians borrowed from that. And I'm saying, forget about Sol Invictus. There's there's dozens of winter solstice festivals before that. Who cares about Aurelian? Wait, let's go way before this. And that's what I've been saying. And then they'll say, but what about January 6th? That kind of seems kind of random. Nope. January 6th isn't random either. Find out, read Epiphanius, read other Christians. Clement of Alexandria talks about January 6th being a feast date that these different cults in Arabia and Alexandria and in Greece that celebrated different gods' birthdays. And then you come to find out that there was this ancient pagan tradition of 12 days after the winter solstice being a date of importance. And it turns out that's what January 6th lines up on.
yeah,
So I'm like, I don't, that's for some reason, that idea has not been explored by
yeah,
anybody. It's just one of those, even Religion for Breakfast, who I'm a big fan of, he says nothing about that. He
yeah.
has nothing to say about that. And he's done tons of videos on this subject. He's yet to come across the January 6th, the January 5th night, the January 6th morning festivals that were happening prior to Christianity. I'm surprised.
Hmm. Wow. Yeah, no, it's fascinating. And also, oh man, just open up a can of worms there in my mind. Uh, what's very interesting is even, yeah, like modern day holidays, if you really track back, like some of them, these things are thousands of years old,
Right.
like, and it's, well, I'd be curious, like, where are you personally coming in on, like, on the Jesus question, right? Like, so for me, right, I love Jesus, and I wish, like, I love Christians. To me, Christianity is, it calls us to, like, carry the yoke of others. The concept of forgiveness is just so profound. Jesus was a total boss. It really inspires me. But then I get all mixed up in my head because I hear I've interviewed Adam Green and other people who talk about Christianity was just a scheme to throw over the Romans. It was like a political scheme, right, made up by the Jews to trick the Gentiles into bringing down Rome. And then you have the
people say the
zeitgeist.
opposite too.
Yeah,
People say the opposite. Say it was a creation by the Romans to trick the Jews into not being so anti-Roman. You get both sides of it.
Yeah, exactly, right. And then you got like the zeitgeist bros and others like the pagan Christ that and what is it, like Dionysius and them. People say that even back to Mithra, like Jesus is just Mithra. Like, man, it's hard to sort this out. So Neal, what's going on here? Like, is Jesus real? What's going on?
First of all, let me comment on the zeitgeist bros, because they do more harm than good. Because what they're doing is when you see those memes getting passed around every year around Christmas time and every year around spring equinox time, which is coming up, you see those memes being passed around of Dionysus was crucified, born on December 25th, born of a virgin, born of this, and then you'll see a whole list: Mithras, Attis, Adonis, and you'll see the list, and it's just a list of things that happened to Jesus being said about these people. And I tell them the reason why this is such a damning thing for people like myself is because there are some truths in comparing these sons of God figures, and some of them do hold those traits. For example, Horus, according to Plutarch, was actually born at the winter solstice. There are other sources that say Dionysus in his Arabian counterpart, Dusharis, was also born of a virgin at the winter solstice. Okay, you got to do these one by one. That none of those guys that I mentioned, Horus or Dusharis, are crucified. None of them had 12 disciples. None of them are like they're just adding extra layers onto these one or two things that they do have in common. And what happens as a result of that is now when I come along and I'm actually looking at what the true facts are, what can we say do they have in common? What are the real things in common? What do the sources actually do say? There's a knee-jerk reaction to stuff I'm doing because they're already been told by someone like Dan McClellan or Bart Ehrman or some of these mainstream scholars that all this stuff is bunk and nonsense. And if anyone tells you it is, they're just lying. And they have this presupposition that anytime that someone brings up Horus or Dionysus or Attis to compare to Jesus, by the way, Attis's death and resurrection is celebrated in the same week as Easter. That's a fact. That's not a conspiracy theory. We can go to the sources. We can prove this. But when I bring this stuff up to people, they're already in the back of their mind. They already heard Bart Ehrman and Dan McClellan tell them that this is all a bunch of bunk nonsense from 20th, 19th century scholarship that's been bunked and outdated. And so they're correct that those memes being passed around and the source. I talked to Peter Joseph from Zeitgeist. We had a back and forth on Twitter, and he told me who his sources were for all those lists of people who were crucified. And it was like exactly
one girl, right? It was like one lady.
It was I forgot her name. DM Murdoch. And her sources are those mythicist scholars from the 20th and 19th century. And it's a lot of this has been proven to be wrong. And by the way, most of it, the big chunk of it, comes from Macrobius' Saturnalia. Macrobius' Saturnalia is a must read. And but here's the thing, you have to be honest about it. It is a late 4th century text. So does Macrobius say that Apollo, Dionysus, Attis, Adonis, Mithras, and Mercury are all the same god born on December 25th? He does say that. That's in the sources. But you got to remember that is a late source. It's a 4th century source. And I think the best way to go about it is saying, as Christianity, I'm not saying that they're borrowing from Christianity, but I'm saying that these two different movements are sort of growing in the same cultural milieu. So it's not like one way or the other. By the way, Macrobius' Saturnalia does draw from sources that are ancient, from classical periods. So there is some truth to this, but you just got to be specific on what you're pointing at. or else people are just going to hear you and think you're nonsense.
Yeah.
But there is a question to be had about the whole zeitgeist thing. It's just not the way they present it. The way they present it is so wrong,
Yeah.
so wrong.
Well, kind of, especially today, right? Just it's so politically polarized, right? Like,
Yeah.
there's that soldier. I'll just give an example, right? There's the soldier who like burned himself at an embassy, right? And
Yeah.
then immediately it was like, the pro-Israels are like, this guy is insane. He's, woke, or he's
Right.
like, a martyr. He's doing it to spread, and I don't want to, obviously get into the politics of that, can of words. But my point is, like, immediately everybody takes this guy's action, right? And then co-ops it for their own purpose, right? Immediately, right? Like he's speaking truth to power, or oh my god, he's a anti-Semite, whatever, right? Everybody's, and then you think, well, let's say a Jesus character, existed, right? The exact same thing would be happening, right? And imagine that, year after year, decade after decade, right? People are, and
good point.
And just
you mentioned.
go ahead.
I know. Go ahead. Finish. Go ahead.
Well, just to add to that, the Catholics, right? They wanted to build a state religion, and the Christians were, getting, starting to pop off. Let's just say that, right? Yeah. So there was like a political incentive to, like, I think you talk a lot about Plato and how he basically wrote, like, the constitutions for countries based off, the ethos of the nation, right? And I kind of think that's exactly what happened with Catholicism, right? And also they're like, okay, we got to blend paganism, we got to take this Christianity, and then we got to take these other myths, and we got to jam it all into one that gives us power, right? And it just feels like this massive, like, co-opt.
Yeah, you were asking me about like what I think about the character or the person of Jesus before I answered that question. To go back to that too, because I'll tie it in with what you just said. I do see that, well, exactly what you just said. I can see why somebody who's countercultural and he leads someone leading a movement and then gets killed by the powers that be, Pontius Pilate, whoever. And you can see how you look at people like George Floyd or the recent events from self-immolation. You can see how those events influence big cultural movements happening in the world. You can see how it can get blown up, and though these people become martyrs for movements, and they get politicized, like you said. And whether or not Jesus as a person said everything that's written about him in the Gospels, whether he said all those parables or not, it doesn't matter anymore. Because what matters is the people writing the Gospels are attributing this stuff to him. People think he said it. People, those distant memories of his martyrdom are thrown into this mix, right? And you do end up getting this countercultural figure in a time where Rome had a system of hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And you have Caesar on top. Yeah. You have the patrician class, then the equestrian class, and then all the way at the bottom, the plebeian class. Yeah. There's different classes, right? Then there's a military equestrian class is the military class. All right, but what you see is there's a hierarchy in place. Jesus, being a Jewish person from Nazareth, his name is Jesus of Nazareth. His name isn't Jesus Magnus Pompeius the Third. This is people on top in Rome have 4 names at least, and they're carrying on the family name of Kaiser or Pompey or, and they have all these different titles and all these different places. Like, for example, when someone conquers Macedon, they get a title of Macedonicus. That happened with Aemilius Paulus in the 3rd century BC. When Rome conquers Macedon, Aemilius Paulus becomes Aemilius Paulus Macedonicus. And Vespasian, when he conquers Judea for the 3rd time, because they've conquered Judea 2 times before that, he gets the title of Judicus. And so there's and then Germanicus, one of the Caesars, one of the Julian Claudians, gets the title Germanicus. Basically, what I'm getting at is you have this world of hierarchy, and it's built upon glory. It's built upon what are you doing for the empire? How are you pushing the narrative forward for Caesar to do better? Like, what are you doing for this cause, right? And it's a very patriarchal world where Christianity comes along, Jesus comes along, Paul comes along. They're very lowly ranked people. Maybe not Paul as much, but Jesus, for example, being very lowly ranked. Israel was very, very poor, unless you were like a high priest in Jerusalem. You probably were very poor if you lived in the Eastern realms, especially in Judea, especially Nazareth too. I mean, the way the Galilee is described in Josephus and not even just Josephus, but in like Pliny the Elder and what's the other guy's name? Nicholas of Damascus. And the Galilee is just this like poor ghetto where everyone's just being crucified and nothing good is going on. And you live in the Galilee, you're not living well. This guy comes out of the Galilee, starts a countercultural movement, and he's preaching. He's got a ministry with women behind him, Mary and Martha, and he's got all these people, and he's saying that the first will be last and the last will be first. Yeah. And this guy is going against the grain, and he's the opposite of Caesar. And he says, let Caesar have what is Caesar, but let's let God have what is God's. He's basically flipping things on its head in this time period. And so what you get, and Nero, it gets the gematria of 666. He becomes the Antichrist. So you have Nero on one side, Christ on the other side, opposites, dueling opposites. Which side is going to win? Well, over time, this idea, Middle Platonism, which is the philosophy of the time period, is very influenced by Stoicism and Cynicism and other different philosophical sects that preach about piety, humiliation, poverty being something that's noteworthy. That's not bad to be impoverished. If you're impoverished and you're still happy, you are a real Stoic. You are a real master of the mind. You are a real divine figure. And those ideas are being floating around in the time where Christianity is rising up. And Christianity becomes this philosophical religion that people are looking at as like something that's countercultural, just like you see with like left-wing movements today. And so these groups, I'll give you an example, a group called the Carpocratians. You probably heard me talk about them on my channel. They're Christians who are living in little pocket societies, communal societies, where when you joined their group, you were told to sell all of your property, give it to the feet of the leaders of the community, and then you entered the community as an equal to everyone else. And they wrote treatises called Republic, same title of Plato, of how to live a society where everyone's equal. It doesn't matter if you're a man, if you're a woman, if you're a patrician, if you're a plebeian, doesn't matter what you are, doesn't matter what your race is or whatever you are, you're all equal under the sight of God. And so this movement becomes very, very popular, not just in Christianity, but even in the so-called pagan world. The Dionysian cults are like this as well. You start seeing this as not just a Christian thing. You start seeing this across the board in all these different cults. The Hephaestorians, the Apollonians, all these different cults that are around in the 2nd and 3rd century are starting to operate in a way where striving to be Caesar is seen as like weak, and striving to be lowly and humble is good. And so Christianity, which is built upon that, you can see how 4th century Caesar would want their society to form around this, because now you're the one that's leading a movement of equality and justice. And so Theodosius was a big example of this. Theodosius in the late 4th century is shutting down all the pagan temples and all the academies and stuff, because he believes that Christianity is the best suited religion for the masses. And there's a movement of equality that happens as a result of that. So yeah, Jesus as a figure sort of embodies that movement in a weird way. So he sort of
Yeah.
does. He sort of should get credit for that. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah. I always just laugh. Like, that's what really inspires me about Christianity. And I always have a soft spot for it. And I come back to it a lot. I just imagine, like, Jesus of the day pissing off so many people. Like, yeah, exactly as you said, like this poor, poor man out of Nazareth in like tatters, just like calling out, the Sadducees, throwing over the, calling out usury, throwing over the money tables, just the whole social order, right? He just threw it on its head. Exactly
Right.
as you said, the last will become first, the first will come last. The meek shall inherit the earth, right?
Right.
All of these things are just like revolutionary ideas, especially at the day when, if you understand the legalism of the day, right? For the
Right.
Pharisees and Sadducees, what he was doing very much was like a revolutionary act. So I always just think
Right.
of that, you know, like he must have been pissing people off, and we're
I agree with that 100%. But I do think it should be noted as well that he's not like he's not the first person to be like this either. What you have what you have with the pre-Socratics and the post-Platonist philosophers, the Peripatetics. You see, by the way, there's a lot of Jewish Peripatetics in Alexandria too, followers of Aristotle and Plato. The philosophical movements of the time period leading up to Jesus, like Hillel the Elder, who says, treat your neighbor the way you want to be treated, that's the whole Torah. Everything else is commentary.
Mhm.
The reason why I'm bringing up these names and these different peoples is these are sort of philosophical undertones of the time period where they do get applied to Jesus, and Jesus gets credit for a lot of it. And maybe he did say this stuff. He probably did piss off a lot of people, like you said, but he's not the first person to come up with this stuff either.
Mm.
So there is a movement. It is sort of a movement in itself coming out of the Hellenistic period into the Common Era. But it's all getting applied to Jesus, and Jesus probably deservingly gets credit for this, because if there is probably there's probably some truth to the fact that he probably did say some of this stuff. Otherwise, why credit him in the first place? That's what I say to people. It's like, it wouldn't make any sense if he was the opposite of that. Let's say he was the opposite of that. Why would you credit him for all this stuff for no reason? So there's probably some truth to it. He probably was, in a way, moving things in a different direction than the status quo. But I do think it also should be noted that you see a lot of these ideas with the Cynic philosophers, with the Stoic philosophers, with the Epicurean philosophers, and a lot of that stuff is in the air.
Yeah. Yeah, man. Wow. Yeah, I could talk about that for man, so long, but I have a bunch of questions for you. One of which is what we call the Gnostics today, which they weren't called that then, just for so people know, right? This idea of the demiurge and Sophia, I'm curious, like, when did that split happen, or are you stating that the early Christians, this kind of concept was the mainstream? So like, when did that split happen between what we know as Christianity today and this concept of
It's hard.
yeah.
It's hard to say when the split happened, because we don't really know. Like Clement of Rome, one of the earliest texts that we have, doesn't go deep into what he thinks about the nature of God is. He just kind of talks about Jesus as being the Son of God and all this stuff. But then you get, I would say, when you start seeing the differences, middle of the 2nd century, between Marcion and Justin Martyr, that's what I would say the split takes. Because the reason why I picked that, I would say 140s. The reason why I go to that, because before the 140s, you have Valentinus and Marcion are in Rome, operating under the church with the bishops and with the they're not like in a different city opposing the status quo. They're a part of the grand church. And we know this is documented. There's no one who would contest this at all. This is just a fact. Whether they disagreed on stuff is another question. The fact that we know is true is that they were getting along and they were all a part of the Christian ecclesia. And so when you start to see the split happen is when I think it's in the 140s when Marcion leaves Rome, when Valentinus loses the election to become the bishop of Rome. That's when it looks like things start to split and fall apart, because then that's when you start getting the writings of Justin Martyr. That's when you start seeing, and then a couple decades after that, you start getting Hippolytus and Irenaeus, late second century. They start writing about heresies. But before that, no one's writing about heresies. Clement of Rome is not saying anything. Ignatius is not saying anything. Ignatius does address Docetists, but he doesn't say anything about Gnostics. He doesn't say anything about Marcion or anything. So that's a big deal, because when we start, the first heretics are not being called Gnostics. They're just Docetists, people who don't think Jesus existed as a fleshly human being. He was just a phantom. That's what they said. That's the first heresy of the church. They say nothing about Gnostics until the middle of the 2nd century, which means a whole 100 years have gone by since Jesus died. 110 years have gone by since Jesus died, and nobody's saying anything about Gnosticism yet.
Yeah,
that should tell you something about if they're heretics or not.
Yeah, yeah. And yeah, just on that point, right? I just think logically, like, if even my best friend, right, told me like, oh, 2 years ago I saw this event happen, right? I would take it with a grain of salt. If somebody was like, hey, like 80, 60 years ago, I saw this event, or somebody I know saw this event, I would definitely take that with a grain of salt. But, I'd be curious, like, you personally, where do you come in on this, just let's say like a Gnostic worldview? So I find both very fascinating, right? And I try to apply it to the world as I see it to determine, what's actually going on. This idea of, my interpretation of the Gnostic worldview is basically that, there's this demiurge that essentially made a bad copy of what, we could call it the heaven realm, or the, base earth, and that there are these entities, if you will, basically trying to trap us in almost like a matrix like situation, right?
Yeah.
I find the whole thing very fascinating, and I dig into a lot of areas like past lives, like possession, stuff like that, and a lot seems to line up with the Gnostic worldview. So I'd be just very curious, like, you personally, like, where do you come in terms of, like, not just scholarly, but in terms of the nature of reality? Like, do you think there is something to this, or?
Well, so here's what I think. Plato's forms is revolutionary.
Yeah.
In all society. Everybody believe Plato's ideas just take over. But before Plato, and Plato credits the Zoroastrians, the Magi, he says. Aristotle writes about Zoroaster as his great teacher of Pythagoras. That's what he says. Pythagoras is like the face of Western philosophy before Plato,
Yep.
before the during the time of the pre-Socratics. They say he's the teacher of Pherecydes, and Pherecydes is one of the sages, and Thales is taught by Pherecydes. He's the first master of Athens. So you have a line of tradition going from Zoroaster, who's a Persian philosopher, and supposedly, according to Aristotle, he teaches Pythagoras. Pythagoras goes down into Egypt for 10 years, 12 years, and then he goes into Babylon for 12 years. Aristotle said this is where he meets Zoroaster, and he learns all this monist, dualist type of philosophy, that there's one God on top, and below this God there's two forces that are at war eternally, Angur Manu and Ahura Mazda. But then he's like, but then underneath this there's different, and so by the time it gets to Plato, puts together this theory of forms, where everything that exists has a form in another dimension that's
Yep.
perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And like, you get this idea. So Platonism, as it progresses throughout the ages, when you get to the first century, it gets sort of influenced by other philosophies like Stoicism, Cynicism, and Pyrrhonism, which is skepticism, by the way. And you start getting, you get this like final product where I think the Gnostics are drawing heavily from the Platonist philosophy.
Yep.
And this is the first thing that Hippolytus says in his On Heresies. He says, these Gnostics are all just Pythagoreans and Platonists.
Yep.
That's what he says.
Yep.
And he goes into why. And he's actually really correct, I think. Because these Gnostics are drawing from the philosophical frameworks of Pythagoras, Plato, and the Magi. And you see a lot of Persian influences. Even the Gnostic texts themselves. There's a text called the Gospel of, or the text of Zostrianos. Zostrianos is the grandfather of Zoroaster. And they're saying that this guy, Zostrianos, met the angel of Gnosis. And the angel of Gnosis told him about the cosmos. And it's basically, he tells him, like, basically it's a Platonist. It's got Sophia, the demiurge, the one. The one is the one. There's no name for the one. The one is just the one. The perfect creation, the perfect creator, self-created,
Mm-hmm.
that from itself creates Sophia, the demiurge, and other different entities. So the Gnostic worldview the Gnostic worldview really is the Platonist worldview, and it's taking the Platonist worldview and applying it to Christianity. And what I'm saying, and what I think happens is Christianity, which comes out of its own tradition, is deciding how much Platonism it wants to incorporate. And so that's where I think the Gnostic versus orthodoxy comes in. It's not that the orthodoxy are anti-Platonist, because they're very Platonist. The Trinity itself is a very Platonist idea. Philo, when he talks about God creating the world, he says he does it through his logos, corporal, incorporeal, and spiritual. So you almost have a proto-Trinitarian view of creation right there. You can say Jesus is corporal because he's flesh. That's what corporal is. It's matter. Corporal is matter. Incorporeal is the God, the creator. And then there's spiritual, the binding together of the corporal and incorporeal, God and man. So you can already see Trinitarian theology even before the Ecumenical Council of Nicaea. Now, what I'm saying is the Gnostics what they're doing is they're going farther with the Platonist philosophy than the orthodoxy is. The orthodoxy is saying, all right, we have too much leaven in the dough. Take some of it out. Like, we don't need all this leaven. We don't need all these ions. We don't need Sophia. It's a little like we can draw some of this back a little bit. So that's what I think is happening. It's not that the Gnostics are adding stuff. It's that the orthodoxy are getting rid of stuff.
Okay. Yeah.
That's the best way I would look at it. Now, as far as what I think, if there's some truth to this stuff, philosophically speaking, I think what they're doing is they're coming up with they're coming up with something to explain reality to the best of their ability of the time period. Platonism fit perfectly for the time period, especially when you look at Heraclitus, Parmenides. These philosophers were super rational, and they were going against the whole Homeric, Hesiodic, pagan worldview. I use that word pagan because they didn't call themselves. It's another example of people never call themselves pagans. That becomes a derogatory term that Christians use. It means rustic. It means uneducated. It means like, hick, you're a pagan. You don't know anything. That's what it means. Well, the philosophers like Parmenides and Heraclitus are teaching people that this stuff is all hocus pocus nonsense. And Heraclitus says it's everything's a state of flux. There is no truth because everything you can't step into the same river twice because the river's going to change. The atomists even go farther than that. The Epicureans, they'll say it's even worse than that because the atoms in your foot are also changing. Now, this stuff, the Epicurean world, the Epicureans and the Heracliteans, that's like damning for people, but they can't wrap their head around it because they're like, well, is there a God or is there a heaven? Is there anything? And they don't have an answer to that. They just leave it as what we know is this, and we don't know anything beyond that. So the Platonists come along and the Gnostics come along, Christians come along, and they give an answer to that. So whether it's true or not is beside the point. The point is you're coming up with a sort of blanket for that, a way to it's not that it's made up and wrong. It's that it's applying a worldview to something to have some sort of guiding morality to live by. So it's not that it's right or wrong. It's kind of necessary to keep the structure of civilization together. Because this is, by the way, goes back to Plato again in his Republic.
The noble lie.
You need something to tell people to keep that moral compass floating in a set direction. Otherwise, it's just all chaos. You don't want chaos. So I don't blame them for that.
Okay. So if I'm hearing you correctly, because I know you take a very scholarly approach, right? Even, to this. And so oftentimes, scholars or, people who dive as deep as you do, speak about it very philosophically and intellectually. I was just more curious about you as a person. Like do you identify as agnostic? Like, do you believe in a God?
I would say I don't claim to know what like God is or what God isn't. I don't consider myself an atheist.
Mm-hmm.
I just say some things we just don't know yet.
Yeah.
I'm open to anything. I'm open to deism. I'm open to even theism. Like the idea of a personal God to me is very hard to wrap my head around, because if you're saying there's a personal God, why can't we talk to him? Yeah. Personal means you and I are personal. We're talking right now. I can text you anytime. You might not be able to answer every time. But eventually you'll hit me back. Now so I get critical of theism in that sense, because it's like, it just seems like that's not the case. Could be wrong. I'm not shutting it down. I'm not saying that's the case. I'm just saying deism makes a lot of sense, because deism says that there's a reason why there's something rather than nothing. Let's think about that. Why are we here in the first place? Is there a purpose to this? Well, deism says there is a purpose to this, and that there was something that started everything off, but he's not involved in day-to-day activity. Therefore, this deity is not concerned with personal matters in your life, and this deity is allowing there to be evil as well. Mm-hmm. For whatever reason beyond our comprehension, that's the case. Yeah. That to me makes a lot more sense.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Very well said. Man, I really struggle with it too. Like for like I believe in God, and I practice gratitude. And I thank God because I have a very blessed life. But also I don't want to be naive to the idea of just the sheer amount of evil and suffering in the world, right? And I find that's very hard to accept a theistic perspective or deistic perspective, of a personal God when we just see this endless suffering, right? And I find it tough to accept like an all-knowing, all-powerful God who would allow this for your children, and the idea that the reason why we're in basically like a hell, if you will, in many respects, is just because some person thousands of years ago, some chick but bit an apple and now we're all paying for it. That's tough for me. But having said that, like the message of Jesus is something that inspires me every day. To be better and to take up your neighbor's yoke and love your neighbor as yourself. I think these very, very deep, profound stuff that's like almost in the DNA of humans, right? Like almost like Jungian archetype. But then also the Gnostics, man, like the simulation theory, we starting to dive into like the nature of reality. We're looking, the deeper we look, there's nothing there, and
Yeah.
this idea of a simulation, it seems like it could also be the case, the Gnostic perspective, like maybe, we are trapped in some type of dream, it's fascinating stuff. Like I kind of don't want to pick a side, and I guess you shouldn't have to, right? It's the pursuit of truth and knowledge. But yeah, I mean, yeah. So I think you've talked a little bit
agree.
about.
No,
go ahead. Go ahead.
You made a good point. It's like a lot of these sort of, I don't know if you want to call them a jab at answering the question of why are we here. That's what a lot of these religions are doing. They're sort of like, it's an attempt to justify knowledge, an attempt to answer the question of what's going on. And I don't think I necessarily blame that. I get it, and I'm open to all these ideas. I like to explore them all.
Yeah.
That's been my approach. My approach is not to shut down anything in particular and just be anti whatever. My approach is to say, well, what are they saying? Okay, well, let's look into it. Let's see what the sources say. Let's see what the archaeology says. Let's see what this says. Let's see. And I want to know. I just want to know, why are these people saying this?
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever read the book Life Before Life by Jim B. Tucker, or heard about it?
No, I have. No, I think I've heard of it though.
Yeah, and even Ian Stevenson. I just recently finished it, and it's blowing my mind. Right. So on reincarnation. I just thought it was total bunk and like hippie stuff most of my life, right? And like,
it was taken seriously. It's called metempsychosis by the Greeks. It was a very serious doctrine up
yeah,
until the 4th century. Very serious doctrine.
yeah, and
Socrates believed in it. It's metempsychosis.
yeah, and I only recently found that out. Like most religions worldwide, this was just accepted everywhere.
Yep.
And even like totally separated. Yeah. I'd recommend you and people in the audience watching to check out that book, because I always just thought it was like wishy-washy, whatever, people want to be an eagle, whatever, but then this guy talks about, it's crazy. Like I emailed this guy, I tried to get on the podcast, but there's hundreds, if not thousands of cases of people, like kids coming back, right? And they're like 5 years old, and they're like, oh, I died in Normandy. My plane was shot over, and my squad members were, named this. And the kids, and the parents are like, what are you talking about? You're 5. And then the kid will pester their parents for like 5 years to go to some obscure legion, and then ends up like meeting the people and having conversations, right? Or
Really?
like, man, there's hundreds of these cases.
Those are interesting. Those, I always want to know those.
Dude, it blew my mind. Jim B. Tucker and Ian Stevenson, they're very matter of fact about it, right? They're just documenting these cases, and they're even kind of ranking it in terms of level of evidence. Even crazier is the birthmarks. So the kid will say like, "Oh, I got shot in the face in my previous life," and they'll have a birthmark exactly where the kid is, and then they'll find somebody who had the name that they said, who got shot in the face.
Wow.
Right? Like they're finding their.
You have to send me those links when this is over. I want to take a look at it.
Dude, it's like mind blowing. And these doctors who wrote the book, like they're very private about it. I don't know why this isn't like breaking news, right? But
well, I can see why though. I can see why, if somebody, because you have to be somewhat hesitant to speak up about some of this stuff, because you're thinking this isn't everyday normal activity that you start hearing about people claiming to be reincarnated. You know what I mean? So I especially if they're not trying to push this as truth, if they're just trying to find out if it's true, then you can see why someone would be hesitant to release some of. I would if someone told me this, you know.
Yeah, he's just like, yeah, I can't do public speaking at all. I'm like, okay. I had
So
a little
he's
back and
oh,
forth.
so you actually got a hold of this
Yeah,
person?
yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
Oh
like
wow.
I love his work. Like it was blowing my mind, right? And it's just so like almost clinical. His book. It's not like he's trying to promote this or airy fairy. Like the dude is, like a scientist documenting the cases, right? And it's just like this is how it is. And then we found this, and then it's crazy. And yeah, like they'll even have pain. Like the kids will have pain in their back, and then you'll find out they'll find the person who died. They're like, yeah, somebody hit me with a baseball bat, and I was paralyzed, and I bled out. And it's like, it's insane. Yeah, right. So that for me like puts it kind of in the Gnostic category, right? And then I've
Yeah. Then
looked.
that's real quick. The Gnostics, um, most of them held to the doctrine of metempsychosis or transmigration of the soul. They called it. Most of them did hold to that belief of metempsychosis, and the Valentinians, the who else? I think the Carpocratians too. I think so. But a lot of most of them were believed in reincarnation.
Okay. Yeah, yeah, it's fascinating. Um, and then also, so I did this deep dive on near-death experiences, right? So like people who have almost died or clinically dead and then came back, right? And there's fascinating stuff about that. Like to me, I think non-local consciousness is something that is like a fact to me. But just so you go through these NDE stories, right? And most of them are like, I saw the light, I saw Jesus, or I saw Mohammed, you know, you know, aligning with their beliefs, or it's their grandmother. But what's crazy is like, let's say 10% of all the near-death experience stories, right? They start asking, hey, show me who you really are. And then they see like reptiles or aliens or scary creatures. And there's this
Whoa.
idea that they're basically manipulating people to come back to Earth. So like one example, right? This kid's like 5, okay? And this angel of light tells him, hey bro, you left like the bread open and that saddened your mother. You have to go back to make amends, right? They're using like 101 manipulation in these near-death experience stories, like these entities that are beings of light. Like you got to go back there because like you insulted your mommy by like leaving the Wonder Bread out, or you have more to learn, and so I've been going down a lot of rabbit holes lately, and so that again, it seems like there is this like
Yeah,
manipulation.
to bring that to the Gnostic idea though, because again, the Gnostics being very aligned with the Pythagoreans held to the doctrine, and this goes into Eastern religions too, the Vedic religions,
Hmm.
um, where you're constantly being reincarnated until you reach a state.
Yeah.
It's called nirvana in the East. It's called apotheosis in the West, but also attaining gnosis is what brings you there.
Yeah.
So Jesus was one of these figures who attained apotheosis. He exited the realm of reincarnation. He became one with God. The Carpocratians, they deified Epiphanes in the year 117. He attained apotheosis. He became divine. He exited the realm of reincarnation. And Pythagoras and Plato, these were all people who were being reincarnated through this wheel, and they'd come back as a new person until they learned more, got more gnosis, gained more gnosis until they reached a point where you were one, you become perfected through their gnosis. Um, that John the Baptist was, and this is in the Gospels. They come back and he's Elijah, right? There's an idea. There's a biblical reference to metempsychosis or reincarnation in the text itself. So it's not like this is biblical too. This is, you can cite where John the Baptist is the new Elijah.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So these ideas, the concept is, it's not you don't want to reincarnate. You want to exit reincarnation. You want to get off the
Yeah.
Ferris wheel, and that's how you attain apotheosis.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, man. It's so interesting, especially when, like for me, when I see distinct cultures that seemingly had no interaction with each other kind of saying similar things, that gets my me interested, right? And yeah, like the Buddhists talk about like a false light, right, versus like a liquid light, and exactly as you said, getting off the reincarnation trap. They even had super secret rituals that they did for like it was like a pre-death ritual, right? For months they would just chant like go out of the light or something like that, right?
What's so crazy about that? Because the Orphics, who also held the same doctrine of metempsychosis, if anyone's wondering, metem, M-E-T-M, psychosis, it's a Greek word. But they did a similar thing as the Buddhists do, but instead of chanting don't go into the light, it's don't drink the water of lethe,
Okay.
forgetfulness. Lethe is a Greek
Yeah.
word. And it tells you when you die, this is a secret initiation rite. If you were initiated into the Orphic mysteries, you were told the secrets of reincarnation.
Yeah.
And that is, when you die, you're going to be very thirsty. You're going to see a beautiful, clear lake. And it's going to call your name. Don't go in the light. Don't drink the water. Go past that lake, and then you're going to have to walk many miles. It's going to suck. You're going to want to die. Then you're going to get to a second lake. That's the lake of memory. And that lake, they're not going to let you drink it. You're going to have to walk up to the people guarding this lake, and they're going to ask you, who are you? And if you tell them that you're a child of Starry Aranos and Gaia, which means heaven and earth in Greek, tell them I'm a child of starry heaven and earth. And if you tell them those words, then you can drink from this lake. This lake allows you to keep your memory. And the reason why you want to keep your memory is because then all those lessons you learned, you're going to take it to your next life with you. And that way you're just that much closer to reaching apotheosis now. Yeah. Imagine going into a new life with all of your memories. You're like a god. You're closer to being like a god. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like, you're getting that much closer to attaining this end goal of being one with God.
Dude, yeah. It's so interesting. And, I interviewed a guy, Howdy Mikowski, and he basically thinks this whole realm is just like an almost hell realm soul trap, right? And, and he makes a pretty interesting case. He got a lot of hate for his position, but like there is this memory wipe component too, where in these near-death experiences, like you can look them up, there's like thousands and thousands, right? Yeah. And they say like these entities convince you, like they're using manipulation tactics. Like if you look like traits of a narcissist, like these stories are that, right? Like, like the 70 laws of power or whatever. And, they convince you to wipe your memory. So to me, like the simulation idea, obviously this is just a framework, right? Because we're in a technical era, so we think in that way. I don't think it's an exact description of what's happening, but to me, it really tracks. And also, yeah, it's like they basically convince you. Yeah, exactly as you said. Like, you're thirsty, go to the water. Or they're like, oh, you got work to do. But then the question is posed like, hey, if your memory is wiped, maybe that's not actually, you're coming back. Like, there's this concept of loosh, right? I don't know if you've heard of this, but that they're almost harvesting our energy. And that also, I'd be curious to get your thoughts, because if you just look at the world stage and how we're manipulated on all sides, it is just like fear. Like it seems like the power establishment literally just wants to get us into a perpetual state of fear, and it almost feels like a siphoning off, well, so yeah, go ahead.
It's interesting you brought this up, because we live in this ultra capitalist world where you're basically taught from early on, if you don't, get a degree and get a good job, or, may have a family or whatever, you're going to be ridiculed and laughed at. And so you are pressured into joining this rat race and getting a 9 to 5 and working all the way until you can't work anymore. And then you can retire, and then you just sit on a couch the rest of your life. And it's like, all you're doing is you're just contributing. I mean, in a way, it's contributing to the grand goal of society itself, which is to further contribute to technology and science and our understanding of things, so that we can one day, I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there, one day get off the planet and further, because this, eventually be the sun's gonna grow,
Yeah.
and the earth's gonna be uninhabitable. So the goal is, if there is a goal, to eventually be able to survive as long. It's all about survival. This is what everything's all about: living as long as you can, and furthering your family line, or having children and them having children. It's all about survival. And it's like this implied thing that everybody is sort of just sucked into.
Yeah.
And it's like, what's the difference between you working a 9 to 5 where you can't go anywhere, you're stuck, you can't take a vacation whenever you want, you have to ask for your vacation? What's the difference between that and like slavery? It's like,
Yeah.
it almost, you almost kind of, it almost in a way, whether you like it or not, you're stuck in this societal normal thing called work, called life, and like, there's no way around it. Nobody's free at all. Everybody has to, you're bound to the things that are dictating where you are in life. You're bound to it. There's nothing away. You can't just go wherever you want. You can't just jump into an airplane and, unless you're a billionaire. But like, you get what I'm saying?
Oh, for sure, man. And that's why, like, both Christianity and Gnosticism lines up for me, because it hit me at a young age. Like, I've chose to live a pretty alternative life. Like, I live off grid on a ranch in the middle of nowhere.
Nice.
I work like online. I have my own online, stuff going on. I live a very different life than most people, but I saw at a young age, like, exactly that. Like, I'm not like an anti-capitalist in that, like, I don't like communism. I think it's still the best system. It sucks right now, and I don't even think what we have is capitalism, because they just print money out of nothing. Like, if money doesn't exist, then, but yeah,
they're both two sides of the same coin. Think about it.
Yeah.
Capitalism, communism, and it's all, one of them's just, they're in both systems. You're working till you die.
Yeah.
So think about it. It's just really like, it doesn't matter which one it is.
Yeah, but just think about it logically. It's like, what is the dominant narrative? It's like, okay, we're at the pinnacle of human civilization, right? Because we have a smartphone, and Elon Musk is going to be president or something. But you look at the world, it is a modern slavery. Like, if you work 50 weeks a year in a fluorescent cubicle doing a job that is likely redundant, like, you are a slave, and then you look at, our food, like, people are getting less and less healthy every year. Like, basically since the 60s, everything's gone down. Like, standard of living, health outcomes, still in 2024, we're still like killing each other, you know what I mean, as a civilization. To me, this idea that we are in a almost hell realm, it makes sense. Like it does feel like a form of, slavery with like Uber.
Yeah. You can see how those Gnostics wanted to drop out of the Caesarian world of hierarchy, and they just wanted to drop out and start their own little communal societies. The Christians too,
Yeah.
You could see, you almost see what they were trying to accomplish in those regards.
Yeah, and it's like, nobody even has, like, there's nobody in, politics or ever. It's really, I think, inspiring a new vision, right? And I think that's what's so interesting in your work, that you talk about Plato. Plato is like really trying to, in his own way, like, almost inspire a generation. But he also he almost, in a way, was like the first eugenicist too, right? Because he was trying to inspire, like, behaviors that would benefit the state, right? So almost like
Plato was an elitist. He was a revolutionary. Plato tried and succeeded in just changing the fabric of reality by, like, he did. He's one of those people you can point to in history and say his life affected the world so much. There's a few people you can say that about: Plato, Gautama, Siddhartha, I guess Jesus, but that sort of Jesus, yes, but it's almost like you almost want to say the idea of him more than just him.
Yeah.
because people are applying things to him, and he becomes like the face of some sort of movement that, in a way, Plato started.
Yeah, yeah.
So it's like Plato and Jesus together are like two hands of one body. But yeah, there's certain people in history that come along and their ideas sort of shape reality in a new way.
Yeah.
Plato's probably the biggest example of that.
Yeah, and some of it is, it's almost like an opiate effect. So you know, like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a really, well-known therapy. It is effective. I've done it in the past, I'm not against therapy at all, right? It's good stuff, right? But something that clued in for me a while ago is like, I'd see people who had like really horrible lives, and then, either antidepressants or CBT, it kind of rewires them like, oh, it's not actually so bad. But it's oftentimes it's like, it's actually very normal to go insane when our world is insane. So there is a portion of it that it seems like it's almost just to try to get people to keep going along with the program. You know what I mean?
I agree. I mean, there's a lot of I think, how do I say this? Because I love people, and I feel like everybody has a story to tell. Everybody has their experiences that sort of dictate how they end up the way they are, and I think it's more rare than common that people are just bad people because they're just bad people.
Yeah.
Usually something's going on with them that makes them into unlikable or just hard to be around. Um, and so I don't want to, like, not to think it's like shit on people or anything, but like when you look around social media and the internet, you see a lot of crap. You see a lot of like just crap, and it's promoted, and it gets monetized. You see a lot of shitty people with shitty ideas making tons of money off their shitty ideas, and it sucks to see that.
Dude, yeah.
But but I think it's just the way it is, and it's just like you have to recognize it and understand what it is, and play your own part instead of becoming I think the best way to round it is not, instead of becoming bitter and being antisocial and lashing out against it, I think it's better to um not just accept it. I'm not just going to say accept it, but almost like to live with it and sort of be play your own part in trying to make things in the world better. It's like that's like the one thing I can say we have a job is to do that. If that makes sense.
Oh, for sure, man. Yeah, and I've kind of come to the conclusion, like,
Nihilism is not the answer.
yeah,
That's what I meant. Yeah.
yeah, and that takes me back to, why I really have a soft spot for Christianity. Like, for me, I think honestly the political system is nothing. Like, I think it's literally just the modern Colosseum, right? Where they're just, they can't legally just put two people in a ring and kill them and throw chickens at them with razor wire. So they do this theater, right, to keep the plebs entertained. But having said that, a large part of my message on this podcast is I don't think even nationally we can really fix things in most countries. I think it's just too divided, too heterogeneous. But I think in our own lives we can really impact things, right? Like, you can help somebody, like even just calling a family member. We all feel isolated. We all feel like we don't have a community. Like, just calling somebody for 5 minutes helps. Start a garden. Give somebody some food. Just do anything. To me, I think that's the revolution. It's just like small acts, and I think that's what I think Christianity is really trying to say, right? Like, this idea of needing to help others, right? And it benefits us too.
Yeah, you it's one of those things that you almost, like me personally, you wish Christianity, the people who are call themselves Christians today would live up to that more, rather than taking their own political worldviews and shifting or shaping Christianity to that. You would hope it'd be the other way around, but
Yeah.
it seems to be more people are applying Christianity to their own political worldview than taking their own worldview and then applying it onto Christian, or yeah, the other way around is what I meant.
Yeah, man. Yeah, it's just like, yeah, you get these mega pastors like, you know, Christ would want me to have this like private jet.
Right.
You're just like, bro.
I don't want to fly around with a bunch of demons.
Yeah, yeah, man.
So
We're about an hour and 40 in. I just wanted to check in, see if you're okay. You want to keep going? Do you want to wrap things up?
yeah, we could probably we want to sort of tone it down, wrap it up soon. But yeah, I got a couple more minutes. Yeah,
Okay,
we're good.
cool. Well, yeah, I'd love to have you on again because I got a ton of stuff for you. But one thing I want to talk about is the flood. Now, this flood myth is something that I think predates basically all religions, right? Or basically the oldest book that we know about speaks about the flood, and most religions and cults all have this type of variation of the flood myth. So I'd be curious in your research, like where are you coming in on the flood? Yeah.
So I would start by saying, because obviously most people know that a lot of these ancient myths have some version of the flood myth. The Bible obviously has a story about Noah. The Greeks had the story about Deucalion. I think the Egyptians had some myth, maybe more than one myth about a flood. Then you have in the East, you have the myth about Manu, and that shows up in the Avestan text. So the Avestans, which is Persian, Persians have the same Manu surviving the flood as the Mahabharata does, which is the Hinduism text.
Hmm.
And so there are some like common motifs happening. And then you can go back even farther to the Sumerians and Babylonians who have stories about Artahasis, and even in that story you have things that line up so perfectly with the story about Noah that it's impossible to say it's a coincidence. Impossible. Because we're talking about both stories, whether it's Noah or Artahasis, you have a guy letting out a raven and a dove for 7 days to go find land and come back. That's too specific for it to be just in two different stories from that are spanning 1,000 years apart from each other.
Mm-hmm.
The Artahasis story is like 2300 BCE. Noah, the first time we start seeing this flood of Noah is way later. I would say 500 BC.
Yep.
That's what I was, because you don't see it. That story is not being mentioned by anybody before even, I mean, let's be honest, 4th century, 5th century, 4th century BC is when you start hearing about Noah in anyone's writings. So it's way later.
Mm-hmm.
But even in Deucalion's story, in Deucalion, the Greek version of the myth story, he has 3 sons that populate the earth.
Yep.
So there's a ton of overlap going on, all these different stories. What's going on here? Well, there's different ways to look at it. Number one is floods happen everywhere. So you can say the flood, there's different flood myths happening in local traditions, and somewhere in Babylon, this story gets passed along, and they're applying their own local traditions to a famous story that's being spread all across the Fertile Crescent. The Hittites had this story, the Greeks get this story, and then you have, the Egyptians have their own like, so maybe you're seeing like cultural motifs that are overlapping in their different areas.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you can say, oh, Deucalion lines up with Noah in this way, but then Artahasis lines up with Noah in this way, and this story over here lines up with that story over here, and you see like a web of different common motifs in all these different flood stories. So what it looks like is it's not just local flood traditions, but also similar motifs that are being passed down from generation to generation, which then makes you say, well, was there a flood?
Yeah.
Well, I don't think there was a worldwide flood like it's described in Noah, But what I do think is happening is there were some grand floods in different parts of the world. And as society goes into the Bronze Age and then progresses into the Iron Age, the big stories that everyone knows that are being passed by Phoenician traders, for example, end up becoming the prototypical story that people tell about these flood myths.
Yeah.
That's what I think's happening. That makes the most sense in my opinion, because then you can explain how the Greek flood myth has certain elements that the Hebrew flood myth has, but also why does the Hebrew flood myth have so many elements that the Babylonian flood myth has, and why is the Persian flood myth had the same character as the Indian flood myth? And then all of a sudden you're like, okay, there's probably some sort of passing down happening from tradition to tradition in different languages, and it's like a game of telephone at the end. And the way you get it, so you end up with the Greek one looking nothing like the Indian one, but the ones in between sort of overlap each other.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. Yeah. And I followed Randall Carlson and others who they do lay out this idea, like modern, like a lot of science, they act like everything happens just like linearly and on the same time period, whereas it seems like a lot of things happen all at once and then not for a while. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, Randall Carlson, I think, makes a good archaeological argument for there being isolated floods. Exactly as you say, it's not like worldwide. You know, it's not like the flat earthers think the firmament all fell down and then the whole world. You know, but there's probably some really badass floods going on, and people make pretty good like archaeological arguments for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can almost see why the story of three people, three suns populating the earth would make sense from any standpoint, because from when you look at the world from a Iron Age perspective, you have the Europeans, you have the Africans, and you have the Asians. And what it looks like, what it would look like to someone living in that time period is these are three different peoples. And I don't mean that in the modern sense of race. I mean that culturally. So it's not just this person has dark skin, this person has white skin. What it would seem like is like the people living in Macedonia have a certain cultural way of doing things. They're all horse riders, they're all archers, they're all doing this. And then the people that are living in Mesopotamia just act differently, have different language, have a different. And so it would look like to someone in that time period, there had to have been three different bloodlines or something like along that fact. You know what I mean? So that would, to me, I'm not surprised about the three sons showing up in different stories. But yeah, I was listening to some stuff Randall Carlson says about, especially he talks about the Younger Dryas thing. That's very interesting because it seems pretty universally accepted that there was huge catastrophic events happening across the world from like 15,000 to like 10,000 BC. And what's interesting about that is after those events stop happening and things start to settle down, that's when civilization starts to thrive. I mean, Göbekli Tepe is 10,000 BC. That's when the first major megalithic structure starts showing up in the archaeology. Next thing you know, that's the oldest cities, Jericho, Knossos, Crete, 7,000 BC, around there.
Yep.
And then agriculture starts getting into more civilizational thing, and then all of a sudden the Iron Age or the Copper Age comes along, and then you get Sumer and Egypt, and then the Proto-Indo-Europeans living in the steppe are not as city based, but still very technologically advanced as far as horse riding, the wheel, technology, weapons. And so whether or not he's correct, I don't know how much, I haven't read much of him, but I don't know what his thoughts are, but he's right about that. I think. I mean, I couldn't correct him, or I'm not the expert there, but it seems like what he's saying makes sense as far as like civilization starts to happen around 10,000 BC.
Yeah, yeah, and I've been diving deep into like the Tartaria. This idea that there are like kind of almost resets and society starts over, but that's a whole can of worms. Maybe we'll talk about it another
That's
time.
what Plato says in Republic, or not
Yeah,
Republic, in Timaeus, I think it is, where he has talks about Solon going down to Egypt, and the priest of Egypt tells Solon, "You Greeks are just little children
yeah,
compared to how old civilization is." And the Egyptian priest tells Solon about Atlantis and says that every 10,000 years the civilizations get reset by
yeah.
flood or something. So that idea is an ancient idea. It is something people have been discussing for a while. Whether the archaeology proves that to be the case is a whole nother subject, though.
Yeah, I mean, there are things that I find very fascinating about that, but yeah, maybe we'll get you on again and we'll dive a little deeper on that. But I'd be curious. Have you looked into the study of astrotheology at all?
Yes, yes.
And
I dove real deep into that um, for a little bit, and I think there's some truth to it. I think there is some truth behind divine myths, stories that are conceived as divinely inspired, having a layer of astrotheology there.
hmm,
Now, I think people get carried away with it. They think everything is astrotheology.
yeah,
Like even like everything from like Jesus walked 3 steps. Oh, there's 3 planets in that. Like everything doesn't have to be astrotheology. But I'm open to like when people do suggest certain stories have astrological layers behind them. I'm open to hear it and maybe see how plausible it is. There, in the writings of Berosus, the Chaldean Berosus, he does talk about this idea of there being ages. Every age is 2,150 years, and in his time period they were leaving the age of the ram and entering the age of the fish, which is
yeah,
according to his map was like, I think it was like the year 100 BC or something. It was very close to what we would call the common era,
yeah,
but it wasn't exactly. People get that wrong a lot.
yeah,
People say they just assume because our church fathers put Jesus at the year 1, they assume that there has to be an astral. It's not. It's actually not true. If you look at Berosus's map, it's like 100 years off, but it is
yeah,
close.
yeah,
100 years is not a long time when you're talking about 2,000 year periods. So there is a close connection there, but it's not on.
yeah, yeah. No, I know exactly what you're saying. Yeah, it's just some of it in the Bible. You look into it, it's like the whole story and the parables. If you overlay the astrology onto it, it's like telling a very almost interesting story. And I know a lot of the secret society bros, like the Knights Templars and even the modern Rosicrucians. I know some of those guys they talk a lot about the hidden meanings in the Bible, and yeah, I find it interesting. But yeah, you make the point too that everyone just takes things too far. Like even these
Yeah.
numerology guys, they break like every single thing down by you can find like 666 and like probably if you break Neal down or Gnostic Informant the right way. And so yeah, everyone just
Yeah,
takes things too far.
you probably find something about my name, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but yeah, it's a very interesting topic in itself. Well, yeah, I'd be curious just to kind of close things off. I'd love to understand just like your personal story. So you're putting out fantastic content and you're digging really deep. You're interviewing scholars. You're doing this for quite some time now. I'd be curious, how has this changed you from when you started your channel, and how would you say the knowledge you've gained through your work has impacts you and how you live your life generally? And yeah.
That's a good question because I think a lot of the wisdom from these philosophers that I like to read, there's a lot to take in there. There's a lot of useful stuff, especially with like Stoics and Epicureans. There's a lot of even the cynics, even like reading about Diogenes and his mentality about the world it's very inspiring, even though he was kind of extreme with it. Um, like some things you can't control, and there's nothing you can do about it, and there's no reason to just dwell in that kind of stuff. Those are some of the things that I think is very useful. Um, as far as the religious side of things, I mean, I'm not anti-religious at all. I think that religions have a purpose, especially when it comes to people losing loved ones and stuff like that, and appealing to their religion for how to get through those things. I see why they exist. I can see why they always will exist. Um, so I just keep open mind towards everything, um, and apply things when I can. That's pretty much it.
Nice, man. Well, with that, Neal, want to thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Where can people find you?
Gnostic Informant on YouTube. I'm also on Twitter, so you can look me up on there as well. And yeah, that's pretty much it.
Awesome, man. Well, want to thank everybody who tuned in on the live, as well as people who are tuning in after. Really appreciate that. Please go give Neal a follow. If you guys want to support me and this podcast, it is buymeacoffee.com/the Spellbreakers podcast. Also the spellbreakerspodcast.com. All right, Neal,
Nice.
I'm going to shut down the stream and I'll just say a quick goodbye offline. Thanks, everybody. And yeah, awesome stream.
Thank you.